Thank you, Speaker. Honourable colleagues. I rise today to speak to Bill C-45, an act respecting cannabis, and to amend the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, the Criminal Code, and other acts. As you may recall from my last intervention in this debate, I have significant reservations about the path to legalization. However, I also recognize that the passage of Bill C-45 is likely. It's for this reason I want to make the legislation governing the future widespread use of marijuana in Canadian society safer for those who are negatively affected by it. The focus of my remarks, and indeed my amendment, which I'll move at the end of my speech, is on protecting young people from the harms of secondhand marijuana smoke. After examining this topic thoroughly, and the legislation that will govern it, and listening intently to the testimony at Social Affairs Committee and other committees, and in debate here in the Senate, it's clear to me that Bill C-45 does not adequately address the serious health risks that secondhand marijuana smoke poses to children and to young people. I think all of us recognize the harms associated with the inhalation of marijuana, especially for young people. The word inhalation is important. We mustn't forget, it's not simply the consumption of marijuana that's dangerous, it's the inhalation of marijuana. Secondhand smoke contains the exact same chemicals as first-hand marijuana smoke. The American Centers for Disease Control and Prevention warn that breathing in secondhand marijuana smoke can affect the health and behavior of bystanders, even more so for young children and young people who are exposed. Their bodies are smaller, their respiratory systems are more efficient, and they have built up little or no resistance to THC. The effects of marijuana smoke may be more pronounced in an enclosed space, such as a house or an apartment. At last Tuesday's Social Affairs Committee meeting, Dr. George Sam Wang, Professor of Pediatrics at the University of Colorado, testified that children can absorb marijuana smoke and it is detectable in their bloodstream. Those frequently exposed to the drug secondhand can be an increased risk for respiratory-sensitive conditions such as asthma, viral respiratory illnesses, and infections. Dr. Wang also writes in the peer-reviewed Journal of the American Heart Association that, quote, 1 minute of secondhand marijuana smoke substantially impairs vascular endothelial function, close quote. Then there is the effect of marijuana smoke, secondhand very much included, on brain development. As has previously been pointed out, young people's brains continue to develop well into their 20s. There is a large body of evidence suggesting that marijuana seriously impedes brain development. Using MRI, researchers from Northwestern University detected alterations in the brain regions involving emotion and reward processing. They found that the more intense the marijuana use, the greater the abnormalities in both brain regions. A major long-term study conducted by Duke University, which followed people born in Dunedin, New Zealand, in 1972 from birth to their early 40s, found that the earlier and more frequently a person smoked cannabis, the greater their measurable loss of intelligence by their late 30s. Other studies among adolescents have identified negative changes to the brain structure and activity as a result of smoking cannabis. To repeat two statements from the chamber yesterday, Senator Eggleton said, quote, I certainly share the view that we need to protect our youth, and Senator Lankin followed. There is not supposed to be a legal way for children to get marijuana. Colleagues, this amendment wholeheartedly supports these positions. We know that the harmful impact on mental and psychological well-being caused by cannabis inhalation is compounded in young people. We know that in some instances these negative impacts may be irreversible. We also know that exposing a person to marijuana smoke at a young age increases the risk that these vulnerable people could develop a dependence, compounding the problem even further. To quote from the Psychiatrists Association of Quebec testimony at Social Affairs Committee, the earlier in life a person is introduced to marijuana, the higher the risk will be for that person to develop an addiction to the drug. Honourable Senators, the effects of secondhand marijuana smoke are real and they are significant. Children do not get to choose where they live. They live where their parents or guardians do. If a parent or guardian smokes cannabis at home when a child is present, that child will be negatively affected, be it cognitively, behaviorally, through respiratory harm, or otherwise. The numbers tell us that more adults than ever are smoking marijuana, and this will undoubtedly increase with the coming into force of C-45. It can reasonably be assumed that there are parents, guardians, guests, or others who will smoke marijuana in a home where and when there are children present. These individuals may not be aware of the drug's adverse effects on adolescents. They may not be aware of the substantial research done on this topic. Regardless, given what we know about the impact of secondhand marijuana smoke on our young people, any ignition of cannabis in a house where a young person is present is a risk. One may not be a big deal, but regular exposure would be. Colleagues, when I was a child, my parents smoked 2 packs of cigarettes a day each. By age 16, I was using an inhaler. The amendment I'll be proposing is one that makes sense and is solely for the protection of those who have no choice. The legislation includes no enshrined protection whatsoever for young people who, at no fault of their own, are subjected to harmful marijuana smoke in enclosed spaces. Indeed, the purpose of this Act, as stated under Section 7A in the preamble, is to, quote, to protect public health and public safety, and in particular, to protect the health of young persons by restricting their access to cannabis, close quotes. Colleagues, secondhand marijuana smoke is access, unintended as it may be. Under Bill C-45 as written, it's entirely acceptable for any individual to smoke any amount of marijuana in their home, regardless of whether a child is present. Article 33 in the Convention on the Rights of the Child argues that governments should take all appropriate measures, including legislative measures, to protect children from psychotropic substances. I would submit that by adding this amendment to the bill, we are bringing it in line with the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and most importantly, doing what the Convention is designed to do: protect children. We would also bring it in line, colleagues, with common sense. Colleagues, this wasn't addressed in any of the committees that studied the bill. There was plenty of discussion around legal age, around trafficking, around other issues of criminality, but not around protecting children from the harms of secondhand cannabis smoke. This is not an amendment that will kill the bill. It's not an amendment that will delay its introduction. It's not an amendment to gain any political advantage. This amendment is about children who have no choice and who are inhaling the substance because they have no choice. It's our responsibility to address this oversight, particularly when it so potently impacts a vulnerable population. Indeed, colleagues, a population that's not simply in the minority, but one that has had no voice in this discussion. A crucial element of our role as senators is to stand up and protect the most vulnerable. If there ever was a case to be made for that, it is this. Therefore, honourable colleagues, I move that Bill C-45 be now not read a third time, but that it be amended on page 15 by adding the following after line 28. 14.1 sub 1. It is prohibited for an individual who is 18 years of age or older to smoke, hold, or otherwise have control over ignited cannabis in a dwelling house when an individual who is under 16 years of age is present in the dwelling house. Sub 2, every individual who contravenes subsection 1 is guilty of an offence punishable on summary conviction and is liable of a fine not more than $15,000 or imprisonment for a term of not more than 18 months or both. Thank you, colleagues.
An amendment. It was moved by the Honourable Senator Wells, seconded by the Honourable Senator Plett, that Bill C-45 be not now read a third time, but that it be amended. May I dispense? Senator Wells, you have 2 minutes left, and if somebody wishes to ask a question. Will you take a question? Senator Eggleton.
Wells, this is a very unusual intrusion into the privacy of a person's own home. I understand you're concerned about secondhand smoke, although this doesn't apply to tobacco. We don't have such a law for tobacco. This is applying to cannabis. And you're saying somebody smokes in their own home with somebody under 16, that they could pay a $15,000 fine or 18 months in prison. What about, I mean, we're talking about the protection of children here, and we know we need to get the information to people about that. Where is the responsibility of the parents in this regard? Why should the government intrude into somebody's home when it is obviously the responsibility of parents to look after the best interests of their children?
Eggleton, for your question, and you're right, where is the government to intrude? But certainly the government intrudes all the time. That's what laws are. They're intrusions on what we might call freedoms. So and as I mentioned, there's no voice for a child. There's no voice for the child at all in this discussion. And that's what this amendment is targeted at. It's for those who have not had a voice in this and who have no choice, Senator Eggleton, in where they live. I have a 9-year-old and a 12-year-old. They have no choice. They can't walk out of the house if I decide to light up a joint. I have a 17-year-old and I have a 21-year-old. They can hop in the car at any time. And that's why this amendment serves to protect those that are 15 years and under 16 years old. They haven't had a voice and they're vulnerable to the results of this legislation.
I'm sorry, Senator Eglinton, but Senator Wells' time has expired. On debate, Senator No.
Speakers, honorable senators, I am pleased to speak to Bill C-45 and support Senator Wells' amendment to protect young people for being continually exposed to secondhand cannabis smoke in their dwelling home. This amendment will make it illegal for anyone over the age of 18 to smoke cannabis in a dwelling house when a young person under 16 is present. I am appalled that under the current version of the bill, it is totally acceptable for any individual to smoke any amount of marijuana in their own home, regardless of whether the child is present. Although most people know that secondhand tobacco smoke is more harmful, the perception remains that marijuana smoke is less harmful to health and less addictive than tobacco. We are now very well informed of the effect of secondhand marijuana smoke. It is as dangerous as toxic as tobacco, particularly to young people. Secondhand smoke puts youth at increased risk for respiratory sensitive conditions such as asthma, viral respiratory illness, and ear infection similar to cigarette smoke. This exposure to secondhand cannabis smoke, particularly within multi-unit housing, is a significant risk that is coming to the attention of the homeowner. According to the Journal of the American Heart Association, 1 minute of marijuana secondhand smoke impairs vascular endothelial function. This study demonstrates the impact that secondhand smoke exposure can have on children. Colleagues, I agree with Senator Wells' amendment because C-45 does not adequately mitigate the serious health risks that smoke poses for our youth. Imagine how much more severe the effect of secondhand smoke would be in an enclosed space like a small house or an apartment with a poor or broken ventilation system. A study performed at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine and published in the Journal of Drugs and Alcohol Dependence measured the THC level in the blood of non-smoking individuals who spent 3 hours in the well-ventilated room with a group of marijuana smokers. This study found that non-smokers exposed to marijuana smoke in an unventilated room tested positive at high levels. Some experienced mild marijuana high and were slightly impaired when asked to perform various tests involving their motor skills. This again reminds us that we have no reason to believe that secondhand marijuana smoke will be benign. Our vulnerable population, including elderly and disabled residents, pregnant women, and children, need to be protected from one people's unhealthy choices. The risks are even higher for kids with allergies or other pre-existing health problems. We all know that personal consumption will increase once the bill passes, which poses a real risk to the health of our young people, whom we have a duty to protect. We have to be careful about the message we send to parents. They shouldn't be deceived into thinking that smoking marijuana around children is a safe practice. This common view is erroneous and very dangerous. According to an article for Reuters Health last month, a growing number of American parents are using marijuana when they still have children living at home. According to the School of Public Health and Health Policy at the University of New York, cigarette smoking continues to decline among parents with children living at home. While the use of cannabis is increasing among parents, this may lead to an increase in children exposure to secondhand cannabis smoke. More parents are smoking marijuana in their homes than cigarettes. This means that when cannabis becomes legal, its accessibility will increase, its penalties will be removed, and permissive attitude about marijuana among parents will continue to go up unless we do something about it. Honorables collègues, notre examen sur la...
Honorable colleagues, the normalization of cannabis and marijuana on young Canadians, their development is evident. The real risks are high, and young people do not know what the effects of this drug are even less on secondhand smoke. This normalization among Canadian parents and the level of consumption of marijuana are very worrisome, particularly because the respiratory health of our youth is being put at risk. Health Canada has indicated that secondhand smoke is negative to the health, and the same is true for marijuana. Secondhand smoke will disperse itself from one room to another, even if the smoker is in an isolated room. It's essential that this bill contain controls, because the consequences will be very negative on the health of our youth. Without repeating the sources of the experts, we have heard from psychiatrists, the Canadian Psychological Association, the acute and constant use of cannabis has slowed the learning of language and intellectual development. The secondhand smoke would be very negative on a youth when there is regular use of marijuana in the house. Honorable colleagues,
of health problem for youth and vulnerable population. I urge you to support Senator Wells' amendment to the bill in order to protect young people from being continually exposed to secondhand cannabis smoke in the old dwelling house. Thank you.
On debate, Senator Seidman.
During debate of our colleague Senator Wells's amendment to prohibit smoking in a home where children under 18 are present, it is important to remind ourselves of some of the concerns with respect to smoking that we have heard during our study of Bill C-45. But before going any further, let's take a look at the data. According to the government's own Canadian Cannabis Survey, smoking cannabis is the most prevalent form of consumption recreationally at 94%. The survey also asked respondents about cannabis consumption methods in the home over the past 12 months. Overall, 1/4 of respondents reported someone smoking cannabis inside the home. But among respondents who had used cannabis in the last 12 months, 74% responded that someone smoked cannabis inside their home. Despite the proliferation of other methods of consumption, such as vaping or oils, Canadians are burning dried cannabis and inhaling it in record numbers. And among Canadians who do smoke cannabis, 3/4 of them smoke it in their homes. With numbers like these, it's clear that we already have a problem with Canadians smoking marijuana in homes where children are present, which is likely only to worsen once cannabis becomes legal and adult use increases. Children tend to copy what they observe and are influenced by the normality of any type of smoking around them. Our experience with tobacco and alcohol suggests that normalization leads to increases in rates of use. Furthermore, experts like the Canadian Cancer Society, the Canadian Medical Association, and others have told us that normalization of cannabis has the risk of renormalizing all forms of smoking, including tobacco, which would be a step backwards for public health. For that reason alone, we would do well to consider the consequences of permitting cannabis smoking in the home where children are present. But beyond the broader consequences for an uptake in cannabis use among young people, we must consider the immediate effects on the health of a child who is exposed to cannabis smoke in their home. New research from the University of California, San Francisco, is getting closer to telling us exactly what happens to our bodies when they are exposed to secondhand cannabis smoke. In the lab, researchers put a joint in a plexiglass box, lit it, and allowed the chamber to fill with smoke, which was then vented out to simulate being around someone who was smoking. Then, an anesthetized rat was exposed to the smoke for 1 minute. The researchers found that just 1 minute of exposure to cannabis smoke made it harder for the rat's arteries to expand and allow healthy flow of blood, taking the arteries 90 minutes to recover, as opposed to just 30 minutes after being exposed to tobacco smoke. Moreover, fine particles, carbon monoxide, and other byproducts of combustion that are known to cause heart disease and respiratory illnesses, such as emphysema and COPD, are present in cannabis smoke and pose a health risk with exposure. Research on this subject is in its early stages, but it suggests that cannabis smoke is just as dangerous as the smoke from tobacco. If parents use cannabis in the home, not only are they modeling behavior that could suggest to their children that it is safe, but they are exposing their children to secondhand smoke. We would do well to remember that smoke is smoke, and all smoke is harmful to health. Secondhand cannabis smoke contains many of the same toxic chemicals as those found in tobacco smoke, and which are known to cause cancer and heart and respiratory diseases. Expert witnesses who appeared before the Social Affairs Committee were clear in their testimony that secondhand smoke is unquestionably harmful. Professor David Hammond from the University of Waterloo told us, and I quote, "Pound for pound, cannabis smoke is just as toxic as tobacco smoke," end of quote. Professor George Sam Wang from the University of Colorado reported that children are being admitted to emergency rooms with detectable amounts of cannabis in their bloodstream, who are at increased risk for respiratory sensitive conditions such as asthma, respiratory illnesses, and ear infections, similar to cigarette smoke. And Pippa Beck of the Non-Smokers' Rights Association told our committee, and I quote, "There is little public understanding of the fact that smoke is smoke and the fact that harm comes from inhaling it, whether it's tobacco or cannabis." Colleagues, that's why the discussion we are having today about Senator Wells's amendment is so important. Canadians are not educated about the harms of cannabis smoke and wrongfully perceive it to be less harmful than tobacco. Without clear action on the part of the government, this mythology will persist. That's why it's so troubling that messages about the harms of secondhand smoke have been absent from the government's minimal public education efforts. Moreover, Health Canada's proposed warning labels on cannabis packaging do not address the specific harms of secondhand marijuana smoke, as they do now on cigarette packs. The Non-Smokers' Rights Association told the Social Affairs Committee that they were shocked that they haven't seen anything from the government to educate people that exposure to any kind of smoke is harmful to the heart and lungs. It's clear that educating Canadians about the harms of secondhand cannabis smoke has not been a priority for the government. And, as my colleagues have pointed out, in addition to respiratory and cardiovascular harm, there is emerging evidence of a direct relationship between secondhand smoke and psychoactive effects. A systematic review published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal suggested that exposure to secondhand marijuana smoke leads to cannabinoid metabolite in bodily fluids, and that people experience psychoactive effects after such exposure. More research is needed in this area, but these are unquestionably serious risks beyond the well-accepted toxic effects of secondhand smoke. Colleagues, we must do everything in our power to make it clear that just because something is legal doesn't mean it's safe. After all, the government claims that this legislation is all about harm reduction. In the absence of effective public education to improve Canadians' understanding of these risks, Senator Wells's amendment sends a strong message about the dangers of secondhand cannabis smoke for young children, and that is why I will be supporting it. Thank you.
Debate? Pardon me? After Senator Eggleton. Senator Eggleton on debate?
Yeah, well, I'm no fan of secondhand smoke. I don't know why the Conservative caucus are suddenly bringing this up. Why didn't you bring it up with tobacco? I mean, people will smoke a lot more cigarettes around a house, and that could have an impact. You know, you talk about extreme cases of the effects. You know, people, the occasional marijuana are not going to have that kind of an impact in their own house. The motion is tantamount to a ban. and on smoking marijuana if you happen to have children. Because the provinces who share the responsibility in terms of legislative amendments on this, most of them are saying they're going to prohibit cannabis in public places. So if they're going to prohibit it in public places, then your own home would be about the only place you could do it. And yet, if you do and you have a child, you could go to prison for up to 18 months or a $15,000 fine. That's an extreme, very extreme penalty case in this regard. I think the answer to this is to better educate people about the harms of smoke, whether it's from tobacco or secondhand smoke from cannabis. I think as this proceeds along, the legalization of cannabis, we will see other products, edibles, for example, vaping that would be less harmful, and I would think we would want to have a very significant program of cutting down on the smoking of cannabis, just as we have in the smoking of tobacco. We've been able to see, because the federal government endeavors in this, all government endeavors in this area of reducing smoking, we've seen quite a reduction over the last few decades in it. And I would think we would want to have the same thing in terms of cannabis smoking as well. But to tell a person that they can't do this in their own home, I think goes too far. You also put people who are smoking cannabis for medical reasons at a difficulty. What are they supposed to do? People that need it for health purposes would, if they have children, have that same kind of dilemma. I think it goes too far to say somebody can't smoke cannabis in their own home and could go to prison for doing it. I think what we need to do is make sure that we get the information to those parents so that they act as responsible parents and help to ensure a safe environment for their children in their own home. But to the government to go into and say it's going to prevent somebody from doing something in there, I don't know how you'd enforce that to start with. Maybe a neighbor would complain or something. Police are not going to be walking into your house to see if you've lit up and you've got a kid in the house. I think it just goes too far. And I would hope that we would reject that amendment. It's tantamount to preventing people with children from smoking at all.
Sorry, Senator Cordy. Senator Seaman, did you have a question?
If I might, if the senator will take a question. Yes, I do, if I might, if the senator
Senator Eggleton, will you take a question? Sure.
Senator, you talked about the enforceability at the very end of your presentation, and I guess my question would be to you, well, by the same token, how would we enforce many other aspects of this legislation? So, for example, 4 plants in a home. Who's going to be able to enforce that, and how is that any more enforceable than this proposal?
That might not be the easiest kind of thing to do. I think, you have to trust that citizens, by and large, are going to do what is the right thing. Yes, there's always going to be oh, no, I know, you don't trust anybody. But you know what, there are exceptions in every case. There's no doubt about that. And certainly the police know how to sniff out a grow-up. They've got a lot of experience at doing that, and those are the main things we want to do. We want to get after the big criminal elements that have been doing those kind of things, and the police will be able to do that. They may not worry so much about 4 plants versus 5 plants unless it's brought to their attention.
Senator Cordy, on debate.
Senator, one of the main points that I try to make in my presentation to support this amendment is also a point that we heard quite a bit about at committee, and that is this misperception that smoking cannabis is not as dangerous to your health as smoking tobacco. And it's seriously unfortunate, I think, and I'd like to hear your opinion on this, given all the money we have spent as a government over decades to encourage people to stop smoking, and now for them to perceive that smoking cannabis is far less risky to their health, could send a signal, even to young people, that it's pretty safe, it's okay, it's not like smoking tobacco.
Senator Eggleton.
Look, anything you smoke, I don't think is very good for your health. I think we do need vigorous programs to get people to cut down on smoking. And I think as alternate products with cannabis like edibles are come onto the market, they got their own issues too. But we're going to have a look at the regulations and see how they go as well. That's part of our recommendations. Then that can provide for a substitute, or vaping could even provide for a substitute, as it is in the case of some people in terms of tobacco. So I don't. I think one statistic, though, you leave out is the fact that on average, people don't smoke as much cannabis as they do cigarettes. Some people are addicted to cigarettes or smoking constantly, quite frequently, and doing so in their own home. So that the damage that can come from cigarette smoking, tobacco smoking, could be even greater, given on average that there isn't as much smoking of cannabis in a home.
Senator Dean, question?
Senator Eggleton, thank you. Given what you've been saying, you may know this, but tell me if you don't, that one of the proposed health warning messages for packaging released by Health Canada over the last couple of months says this, warning, cannabis smoke is harmful. Harmful chemicals found in tobacco smoke are also found in cannabis smoke. I just wondered if you were aware of that, whether that would be supportive to you.
Little details, good point.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Speaker. And thank you, Senator Wells, for raising the issue of secondhand smoke of cannabis. And I've spoken in the chamber. I know Senator Seidman has also spoken in the chamber a number of times about secondhand smoke and about the dangers of smoking tobacco. And I think the same thing holds true for secondhand smoke for cannabis. And I don't think that there's anybody in the chamber who would deny that secondhand smoke is harmful, not only to children, but to adults as well. I guess I'm quite concerned about the enforcement of this. I'm not quite sure. Does a police officer knock on your door, give a little sniff test, check to see that it's cannabis, and then does the bed check to see how old the children are in the household? I'm not quite sure about how it will be enforced. But more importantly, I've heard about being tough on crime, but smoking cannabis, if this act passes, will not be criminal, so will not be a crime. But we're talking, a number of you who stood up spoke about protecting children from secondhand smoke. And indeed, this is what the government is intending to do, is to protect the children through regulation and through the law. But let's look at this scenario. We've got a neighbor walking by a house. The curtain's open, they see somebody smoking up in their living room. They phone the police. The police come along. Not only do they say, well, they can't tell them to stop because it's legal, but instead they go in and they take the person to jail, because according to this, you can be imprisoned for a term of not more than 18 months. So they take the parent to jail. I'm sorry, but if we're talking about protecting children, but we're going to take the parents to jail for doing something that is legal, do I think they should be smoking cannabis in their households? No. Do I think they should be smoking cannabis, period? No. But it's legal. It's legal. So now we're going to be arresting people, putting them in jail for 18 months because they've smoked cannabis in their house with children under the age, is it 16 or 18? Under the age of 18. I think that's getting a little bit carried away, and definitely, Senator Stuart Olson used the term, I think, earlier about using a hammer. I think this is using a sledgehammer to kill a flea. It's just, and it's not protecting children. In fact, it's going to be harmful to children to take their parents to jail for doing something that's legal.
Ready for the question? It was an amendment that was moved by the Honourable Senator Wells, seconded by the Honourable Senator Plett, that Bill C-45 be not now read a third time, but that it be amended. May I dispense?
Senator Bernard has stood.
I'm sorry, Senator Bernard, did you wish to speak?
Is there an opportunity to ask Senator Corder your question?
Yes, Senator Corder still has a few minutes left, so if you wish to ask her a question, go ahead.
So thank you, and like others here, I certainly agree with the spirit of this amendment in terms of the effects of secondhand smoke on children. However, I think, like some of the other amendments, there are unintended consequences. Senator Corder, you talked about the impact that if a parent is found to have smoke in the presence of their young children, they could go to jail. What would happen to those children in terms of the care and the welfare of the children in such cases?
Senator Corder.
Thank you very much, Senator Bernard. That's an excellent question, and I know you're a social worker and you've dealt with this many times, and we know that the children would be taken into protective services by community services, it's called in Nova Scotia. I'm not sure what it's called in other provinces, but the children would be taken out of the home unless there was a grandparent or somebody else who would take care of them. And I know that this would not be helpful to children. And as a social worker, you would have seen what this does to families. And unintended consequences, we're just doing a prison study in human rights, and we see the number of women who are in prison and what this does to families. So it would not be helpful to children, to parents, or to the family situation. For something, by the way, that would be legal.
Are senators ready for the question? An amendment that was moved by the Honourable Senator Wells, seconded by the Honourable Senator Plett, that Bill C-45 be not now read a third time, but that it be amended. May I dispense? Is it your pleasure, Honourable Senators, to adopt the motion? All those in favour of the motion will please say yea. Yea. All those opposed, nay. Nay. In my opinion, the nays have it. We have agreement for a 15-minute bell. The vote will take place at 6 minutes past 6. Call in